It's been over a year since I last talked about this topic, and a lot has changed since. A lot of things have been adjusted in Smite, and a few new things have been added, so it's time to talk about this again. Do not build these items early. There are quite a few items that can be very powerful for your character in the right stage of the game, but for those items it's not necessarily the early game where they are most powerful for very different reasons. We're going to talk about these items and the reasons. We're going to go through this alphabetically, just so you have any structure to it. This also primarily focuses on Conquest, as some things are different in other game modes, but most of it is applicable to other game modes too. The first item is Bloodforge. Now, Bloodforge is one of the more debatable ones, as there are a very few niche cases where it can be built early on. The reason for Bloodforge not being recommendable early is not only that it's 2,800 gold, but also that other items, or one specific other item, fulfills a similar purpose for a lower price, and that is a Devourer's Gauntlet. If you're early in the game, you have the time to stack, and you get certain benefits out of Devourer's Gauntlet that doesn't come with Bloodforge. You also have RC as an alternative early game item choice when it comes to lifestealing, and that is even cheaper. Bloodforge comes with a lot of power, but not penetration. In early game, the base damage of abilities is mostly more important, and penetration affects the base damage, so that's usually more beneficial, which is also what makes RC so much better than Bloodforge in many situations early. It also comes with 15% of lifesteal, which is not bad, but also not the highest value you can get, and the passive only really matters when you get a kill. Kills happen more in later stages of the game in most games. So why is Bloodforge a little bit more debatable? In Assault you cannot build Devourer's Gauntlet, and as such you're left with RC or Bloodforge, and sometimes for some characters Bloodforge can just be the better choice. Higher basic attack damage comes with it, and you can buy it at the start of the game, you don't have to wait for the gold, so that can be nice, though I wouldn't say it's necessary at the same time. Outside of that, if you really want the power but you fell so far behind that you feel like there is no way you can farm up the stacks and be relevant that you would need for Devourer's Gauntlet, but lifesteal is not that important to you, for example on, say, Cupid, who can get away with less lifesteal or even no lifesteal at all, then you can consider Bloodforge instead. I wouldn't recommend it most of the time, you can usually get more value for your money, but there are some fringe cases. And talking about fringe cases, the next item used to be a fringe case, and that's Book of the Dead. Book of the Dead used to provide you with a decent amount of health, mana and power, as well as a shield, and so for some magical gods, like for example Kronos, it was a solid choice in some situations. In the next patch, however, Book of the Dead will receive changes. It will no longer provide health, and will instead calculate based on your total mana, not current mana, for the shield, and the shield is increased from 15% of your mana to 20% of your mana, while the health threshold is lowered from 50% to 40%. That means Book of the Dead now heavily depends on having a large amount of mana. In the early game you will not have that much mana, and Book of the Dead on its own doesn't provide that much mana. It would be very good tied with a Book of Thoth beforehand, but then it's not early anymore. In early game and by itself, Book of the Dead hardly has any value over other items now, and even in late game it's maybe not as valuable anymore. The next one was for a very brief period of time built in the mid game, but now it's just back to late game, and that's where it belongs. And that is Deathbringer. This item is not only super expensive with 3000 gold, has relatively low power, no penetration, does nothing for your abilities. With 40 power for that price, you can really get better stuff. It just also relies on crit chance and amplifies your crit. And crit simply is a late game stat. Crit is a stat that gets you more DPS out of your basic attacks, not your abilities, which you are more focused on in late game. It works better when you have more attack speed beforehand. It works better when you have, for example, lifesteal along with it. It also helps if you have some penetration, and all of this is something you want to have before Deathbringer. Now there are crit stacking items like Rage that you can build around mid-game, which will amplify Deathbringer, but Deathbringer on its own as a first crit item is usually not a good choice. The next item is Mail of Renewal. With a total price of 2,250 gold, this actually isn't that expensive, but there's a good reason why there's no value in building it too early either. It comes with 400 health, 10 HP 5 and 10% cooldown reduction. Not bad stats, but also not very focused defense or anything, it's just a lot of health. The reason why it has very limited value is because of the passive. The passive is you gain 15% of your maximum health and mana over the next 5 seconds when you get a kill or an assist against an enemy god or an objective. In early game, usually you're in a 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 situation in most of the cases. And in those situations, Mail of Renewal doesn't do that much. If you kill a target and you get a small heal afterwards, well, good for you, you would probably back anyways to buy the next item. In a 2v2 it can help a little more, but how often that actually would lead to a second kill that otherwise doesn't happen when you're 2v1 is very questionable. The big benefit of Mail of Renewal is in late game in team fights when more people die or when more structures go down. So really in early game you're mostly wasting gold on a passive that's not very helpful, even though the other stats are decent. There are just better items with better stats, for example auras, especially for supports, that help you more, or specific defense items for solo lane. An exception here can again be other game modes that have more team fights going on throughout. And that brings us back to the crit section. The next one here is Malice. Malice has the same price and very similar stats to Deathbringer, 3000 gold, 40 power, 25% crit chance, but the passive is a bit different. On a successful critical strike, your abilities deal 35% more damage for the next 3 seconds. That means that as a single crit item, Malice does better than Deathbringer stat-wise, but at the same time, again, you want other stats before you want crit, so it becomes more beneficial. As Malice is specifically targeted at guards that also use abilities, you will definitely get more out of penetration items early on, or mixed items, especially items like Crusher will overall make your character perform better with a better power curve as well. You don't have to save up for that long, and you can aggress on enemies earlier with more impact, so really something for late game. Then there is Mantle of Discord. Mantle of Discord is one of those super expensive ones with 2,900 gold, and that already takes away a lot of the early value because the power curve is just bad. It comes with 60 physical and magic protection and 10% cooldown reduction. Good stats in themselves, but also not the highest in effective HP if you're targeting a specific type of defense early on. And you also have a passive effect that doesn't do that much early in most situations. The big deal with the passive is that it's a stunning shockwave for all enemies around you when you hit 30% health, but it doesn't make as much of an impact if you only stun one person as opposed to triggering this in a team fight when there are 3 people around you. Again, a simple case of in early game there are other items with more benefits for you as a support or as a solo laner, be it auras or be it more cooldown reduction or other effects and lower price tags. Now we have a Polynomia, also a bit more interesting as it's 2,300 gold, so also not that expensive, and the stats themselves are not bad either. 75 magical power, 300 mana and 12% magical lifesteal. The big deal here, the passive is using an ability gives your next basic attack within the next 8 seconds plus 75% of your magical power as an additional magical damage. Here's the problem, if you don't have much magical power yet, then this passive does a lot less for you. 75% of 100 magical power is just 75 damage after all. But as your power ramps up throughout the game as a mage, this item becomes a lot more potent. I wouldn't say it's absolutely horrible in any situation early on. I'm sure with new Freya we might actually see some purpose for it, but overall I would not recommend building this item too early. At least get one solid power item and boots beforehand. Rod of Tahuti, the magical equivalent of Deathbringer, but a little bit worse at the moment. 150 magical power, 30 MP5 and 25% bonus damage on basic attacks and abilities against targets below 50% health for 3,000 gold. The main reason here is simply the power curve being terrible, with it itself costing 1,400 gold and you just being on a dry spell for any sort of damage until then. And there are just other options that provide you with very high amounts of power and other good stats early on that help you more. Later in the game, still an okay item, not the most bought anymore, but early in the game, just don't build it. Then we have Soul Gem. This one is basically the same story as with Polynomia. 2,300 gold, 65 magical power, 150 health, 12% magical lifesteal and 10% cooldown reduction. And the passive is after hitting 4 abilities, which you will obviously also hit more of in late game, as you will be able to use more abilities with more cooldown reduction. Your next ability deals 30% of your magical power as bonus damage. 30% of 100 is, again, just 30, so the more power you have, the more impactful this becomes. Another lifesteal item is Typhon's Fang. Typhon's Fang is also getting a change in the upcoming patch. It will now have 80 magical power, 200 mana and 10% magical lifesteal for 2,800 gold. So for that price it's already a relatively low amount of power. On top of that, your healing obtained from magical lifesteal is increased by 40% and your magical power is increased by double the amount of lifesteal you have. So this item again benefits from you having a lot of lifesteal in the first place for it to work properly, so you want to have at least another lifesteal item beforehand and probably boots too. An item we can go over very quickly is Wind Demon. It comes in at 2,800 gold, has even worse stats than Deathbringer or Malice just from the raw stats itself, just a little bit of attack speed in return, and the passive also relies on having crits. So again, very expensive, not the best stats, more for late game when you have enough attack speed and everything to warrant this item, even if it's not the best item in general at the moment. Will be reduced in price next patch to 2,700, doesn't really change the picture though. Another group of items that I'd quickly mention here is any penetration item, especially Titan's Bane Obsidian Shard. Why? Because in early stages, flat penetration items are usually better. For example, if a target only has 50 physical protection, then Titan's Bane does 15% of that, so 7.5. Meanwhile, any flat penetration item for a similar price would have 10 to 15 penetration and also other stats along with that, which will help you deal more damage. So as such, Titan's Bane should not be your first penetration choice. Same thing goes for Obsidian Shard. There are some pen items that are more reasonable to build early. Executioner can sometimes be built after boost because it also has decent attack speed along with it, but typically you want at least one power or lifesteal item, your boots, and then you can consider Executioner. Demonic Grip also is kind of in the same place, usually a bit better a bit later, for example if you build a Hastened Ring beforehand. And then there's Spear of the Magus, which is the only one that kind of stands out here as it's just flat reduction, and that actually does a lot more, so that can theoretically be built right after boots. But again, I also think here it makes sense to have some more power beforehand. And as the very last but not least item, we have one that is good on some but bad on others, and that is Respite of Valor. Respite of Valor comes in at 2,300 gold, not too expensive, 65 physical protection, 300 mana, 10 MP5 and 20% cooldown reduction. These stats are pretty solid for solo lane if you're against a physical character. For support on the other hand, these stats usually do much less for you than building into a traditional aura item, especially Sovereignty, as that will just provide your teammates with more than the 20% cooldown reduction could, with very few exceptions in very specific situations with, for example, a Capri ult or maybe the best timed gap shield in the world, but that's so unlikely compared to the pure damage reduction that you would get out of Sovereignty in comparison that I would say just stay away from this early on. It's not even cheap, it's not really built as an early support item. Just opt for the auras instead or opt for other items that are more accessible. But again, for solo lane, it's absolutely fine. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful and gave you a good overview. I have had requests for the opposite of this video, being build these items early, so I will do that in the future as well and talk about which items are good to build early and why. If you're interested in that as well and you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out too, and you will get notified of that video. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.